Long ago, some thousands of years back, the Israelites were led by Moses out of Egypt toward the Promised Land. As they made their way through the Judean wilderness, the people clamored for food. God provided bread, manna from heaven. The manna fell from the sky like snow, and God instructed the people to collect it, make bread from it, and they thrived. The Israelites had just enough time, just enough resources to make bread with haste and live off of it in the desert. The bread back then was really a cracker. It's where we get matzah bread used today in Passover meals. By the time several hundred years later that Jesus was on the scene, humans by that point had perfected a newer ability in an age where we remained in one spot for a lifetime. With simply grain and water and a lot of patience, we discovered that nature could take its own course and create its own leavener from the bacteria in the air mixing with the flour and the water, and manna took on new meaning. We perfected rising bread with life, no longer a cracker, not even a pita, something instead that was cultivated. It was grown and it was nurtured. Bread making was something we offered as gifts, as symbolic as the best we can offer back to God. Now, all of this talk of bread got me so hungry recently that I've been taking sermon prep a bit too seriously. So after studying the America's Test Kitchen recipes, and you see the show on PBS, I decided to make the ultimate in patient bread making bread, the sourdough bread. Oh ho, anybody made one before? Yes, so you know where I'm going with this. You need a starter, of course. That's what I've got right here. Sometimes it's called a mother. And it is at least a 2-week process if you want to do it right. Really 2.5 weeks. So all my life I have cooked and baked a lot of quick breads, some breads with yeast, commercial yeast used in there. And it was only when I saw the America's Test Kitchen program where they look at the science of things like this. And it turns out that sourdough bread is not including yeast. And that just simply blew my mind. Sourdough doesn't use yeast. Instead, over several days, you work in your kitchen like it's a laboratory. And the flour mixes with water, and every day you do something to this concoction, and a little bit comes out, and some of it goes in the trash. Then you add more flour, and you add more water, and it rises and rises and gets bigger and bigger. And eventually, after about 14 days, you can use this to make the actual loaf of bread. So in fact, as Tom Petty once sang, the waiting really is the hardest part. And what it needs all of the bacteria in the air, all our breath, all of those little nuances that we can't see. That's going to give the bread its own flavor, its own life. So it really is the ultimate local source food. Now, every now and then, me, who I am completely impatient. I want bread and I want it right now, just like Oprah. I need to be reminded that the universe is a little bit bigger than myself, and bread making puts me in my humble, patient place. Jesus recognized that creation and offering of bread had significant value in understanding the vast expanse of God's love. And so he took that bread and gave thanks, which here in John's Gospel is the only communion mention as we know it. Jesus is saying essentially, take this bread and use it to remember me by. Living tokens, the best we can offer to God. And now our bread and communion is infused with Christ through the Spirit. It's no coincidence that the Greek word John's Gospel uses today for giving thanks is the origin of our term Eucharist. because the Eucharist is the ultimate embodiment of this age-old theological process. Baking bread is taking our fragments, our gifts from the earth, from God, like manna from heaven. And now that we are no longer desert wanderers, we bake that bread. So, Dom Gregory Dix is a 20th century theologian who inspired the reform of the Roman Catholic Church and the Anglican Church. It gave us eventually the 1979 Book of Common Prayer in there, which made the Eucharist central to our worship life. And Dom Gregory Dix, in mapping out this theology, crystallized it down into 4 simple words that happen in every Eucharist: take, bless, break, give. Take. Bring our baked bread, the best we can offer up to God, and present it with the wine and our offerings. Bless. Let the chief celebrant among a room full of celebrants give thanks and ask God's blessing upon the bread, infusing it with the presence of Christ through the vessel of the Holy Spirit descended upon it and upon us. Break. The bread is broken. And though the bread is becoming body in a theological way, it's not, as many assume, the breaking of a body that mimics the breaking of the body on the cross. No, it is the splitting of one whole piece into 2, and again and again. This one piece becomes many pieces for many people. And finally, give. Those pieces are given out, consumed, nourishing us. And maybe it's perfect if we come physically hungry to this table, because a nibble of bread will satiate us just as the metaphorical body will sustain us. Now, I have to admit, with apologies to our gluten-free friends here talking about all of this baked bread in Grace Church, I have to admit, when I first arrived here, I was very skeptical of bread that we used at communion. I came from a larger church where we used wafers because we had to better account for the numbers of people there. And as some of you may recall, my first few weeks, probably still to this day, I was having trouble figuring out how to break up the bread at communion into the right proportions. And I think I identify more with Philip in John's Gospel today, actually. Because how on earth can we make this bread work for this many people? And I forgot in that process that God will provide. John's Gospel today reminds us all that this is precisely the point of having real bread at a Eucharist. John's Gospel begins, of course, a 5-week study of the bread of life of Christ with the feeding of 5,000, the only miracle of Jesus that is told in all 4 Gospels. Somehow, some way, those 5 loaves and those 2 fish that young boy brings to Jesus were broken and shared so that all were fed, and even more were saved and left over to be stored like manna from heaven and used for another day. Somehow, some way, that life-giving Spirit of God working through Jesus Christ allowed the new Israelites to proceed through the metaphorical desert another day. This is God, who Paul today proclaims in the letter to the Ephesians, who by the power at work within us is able to accomplish abundantly far more than we can ask or imagine. Patience, perseverance, and providence. When we seek God to provide in our lives, we sometimes have to be as patient as a rookie sourdough bread baker. The Israelites lasted an entire generation in the wilderness, and it was only the next generation that actually made it to the promised land. So talk about patience. But God is worth the wait. In sorrows and fears, travels, travails, God will provide. God will provide just as with the manna in the wilderness, just as with the feeding of the 5,000, just as our hearts are touched in the smallest of ways, even in the magic of the rising loaf of bread. Amen.